Hey friends, Paisley and Glue back, and I've recently just been able to pick up YouTube again. I had to take a really long hiatus, and I realized that I have footage from Winnie Sanderson from like over a year ago that I have not released. And I think I thought that the overdress was not going to take me as long as it did. Here we are. So I'm going to release the first part of that now, and then hopefully the rest of it will be forthcoming in not too distant of a future. A lot of the time was spent doing the gold work on the bodice and the skirt, and that was like over 200 hours of work. So if you are just joining me, I am making a 18th century version of Winifred Sanderson from Hocus Pocus, and it's sort of combining my love of historical costuming and Hocus Pocus, which is really just like a lifestyle. So it is now the end of 2021. I started this over a year ago, and here we are. We're still doing it, but I think the end result is going to be worth it. So thanks for being here. But this is sort of detailing the patterning and the fitting process of the bodice and the overskirt. So let's talk about that today. And I did go into a lot more of the sort of construction process of this. If you have any questions, please ask me in the comments. I tried to be better about sort of filming things as I went, as opposed to just talking about them after I'm already done making them. Okay, so this is like some semblance of what I am making. So right now I'm starting on my overskirt here, which is also attached to the bodice. So this book is really cool. This is the Patterns of Fashion by Arnold, and this is 2, I think. Maybe it's 1. I forget which one this is. I think this is 1. They are in the process of reprinting these. They're currently super expensive to buy, but I think next year they're supposed to reprint this. The rights have been purchased by a UK company, and so they will become much more affordable. Highly recommend. All of the patterns are laid out on grids, so you could just expand this, like each square corresponds to an inch. So it's pretty easy to make a grid on a paper and then blow up your pattern, kind of compare it to your own measurements, and then make alterations as needed. So this is kind of what I'm doing. So here's some detail shots here, and then here are the pattern pieces for that. So I'm roughly doing what this is. So I measured from here to here, times it by 8, and which is based on how the inches correspond to real life, and then double that because this is center back and this is the front. So that I believe was like 112 inches. So that's kind of where I'm starting out for my skirt width. And I'm actually going down a little bit because my fabric is like 54 and a half. And I don't really want to piece like a 4-inch section to the back. So I'm going to just cut 2 widths of fabric and then seam it down the center back. And then because of how my decor is in the front, I could end up piecing in that extra width by adding this section. But we'll see when I kind of pleat it up on the dress form if I think that I will need that. And then the way that I'm going to make this skirt is I've got this beautiful green taffeta. And the way that I like to do period skirts like this, I don't want to see a hem here. And you're always going to see even the tiniest little invisible prick stitches for a hem stitch on this. So what I like to do is flat line the whole skirt in an organza. You can use a silk organza if you like, which is just a little nicer, but this is just a poly organza, which is much cheaper. And it will actually help give us this little bounce and poof to the skirt. It'll help kind of keep that bounciness to it, which will sort of an added layer. And then you're actually going to hem the skirt up only to this layer. So the great thing about that is that we won't see the stitches at all because they'll be stitched only through the back flat lining layer and not through the taffeta. And it's a trick that I learned in theater, but it's also something that they use in couture sewing too. I do this by machine. They'll do it by hand, so it's beautiful and lovely. By machine is much faster, but I'll show you that as we get a little closer. So here we are today, and I'm gonna work on pleating up the overskirt of my dress. And I want to show you a couple things about how I'm going to go about doing that, and then we will do it. So the first thing is, so this is the overskirt pattern that's shown in the Patterns of Fashion book. And I just wanted to show you kind of what the top of this is going to look like. I'm going to do this on the dress form, but just so you know, when you are pleating something that goes over a pocket pannier, this is what your top is going to look like. So you might think in your brain that it's going to be a straight rectangular piece of fabric, but the way it's pleated into the skirt is actually, or pleated into the waistband, is actually on a an angle. And actually, if you look really closely, this is actually the line that goes into the bodice. So because the bodice dips down in the back and has a point, it actually goes even lower than this line ends up. So this line is just sort of, this fabric is sort of folded down below the waistline. And then we come up, we need to come up to go over those pocket panniers because they pop out so far on the hip. There's a slit here to access your hanging pockets or your pocket panniers in my case. And then it dips down in the front because again, we have, partly because of the shape of bodies, that they're cylindrical, and partly because the front of the bodice also dips down a little bit. And that also means that your hemline is also going to be not a straight line. And that's something that you always want to leave the hem to last, but just so you know, when you're cutting your piece, you always want to make, I cut my fabric so I added some length to the bottom and then cut it this high. So that's 6.5 inches tall times 8. So that's something like 50, I think I cut mine 55 inches long to make sure that I had plenty of length or height wise from the top to the bottom to get the skirt that I want. And then I have also got my overdress panels cut and flatted to my organza. And at some point this week, I'll probably do a preliminary pleat up of those as well. So it's coming along and we shall continue. And then here we are at the dress form. It's important obviously to have all of the understructure. So my petticoat and the pocket panniers and the overskirt are all on here. I have the stomacher pinned on so I can see where my point needs to come to, which is here. And then this is my overskirt. So I'm gonna go ahead and drape this on the dress form, pleating it up so it looks pretty. So to start with, I've pinned my center back at the center back, and you can see it's coming up a lot higher in the back. And as we come around, that's gonna dip down slightly. Towards the front. So it's best just to do this either on the actual person if it's not for you, or on a dress form. You're just never going to get the right sort of pleat angles and figure out how to make it look pretty if you try to do it flat according to what it says in the book. to pleated this guy up to some semblance of what I think that's going to be. And then I added my little placket here so that I can get down into my pocket, which is now 2 layers down. So I've got the overskirt, this is the underskirt with the petticoat built into it, and then underneath that is the pocket pannier. So if you reach all the way through there, then we have access to this pocket. I might make a bit of a lining into this pocket pannier so it's more like an actual pocket and not like an insane pocket that I can reach down into with my elbow, just to make it a little bit more practical as to actually holding things and being able to find something while I am wearing this dress. But it's kind of fun to see it pleated up. So here we are. We have made the mock-up for the top of our Winnie dress. And this is just the first mock-up. I've just fit this onto my dress form. This pattern came from Patterns of Time. So this is the one that I did. So it comes with this sort of graph here. And the size for me seemed somewhat okay. So I just went ahead and blew this up to full size and then cut it out of muslin. And so that's what is on the dress form right now. So we can see this dress form is like somewhat my size. I'm a little bit more sway backed than what this shows, but it looks like we've got a little bit of an alteration under the arm here and a little bit here, which may end up being more pronounced when it actually is on my body. The arm's eye was also kind of weird. This was the seam allowance, the line on the pattern, which seemed a little off for me. So I'm gonna go ahead and drop it down to here before I even put it on myself. But it seems like this line is like somewhat in the right place. And then we'll also adjust the neckline when I try it on myself. This period, the bodice fronts tend to be on the bias. So this whole front panel is all one piece, and then it comes to a back side seam here. So instead of having a side seam here on the side of your body like we do in modern clothes, it's all the way back here. So that's why it's on the bias, so it can like curve over your body. And then it's got, this is the sleeve that came with that dress. I don't know, we'll see if I go ahead and keep with this one. I don't know that I like the darts along the top, but you can see it's got this really deep set sleeve back in it, and that's really typical of this period. And then it's got this big elbow dart, and then your little forearm just kind of comes out that direction. So this is a good go around. The design for Winnie actually has a stomacher, which I'm like playing with periods and kind of cutting and pasting. So I'm actually going to go ahead and cut part of this away and then add a piece on the straight in the middle, and that is going to be the stomacher piece. And then the top will actually lace over the top. So I actually may end up draping something that will end up being a lining that is not on the bias, because otherwise it's going to stretch way out when you try to lace it tightly across the body and not be super pretty after a while. So that's where we stand here, and then I'm going to take a couple alterations here and then go ahead and try it on myself. So this is my first try on before doing any alterations, and you can see it's pretty loose on me. I had added that straight panel in the front to mimic the stomacher, what that's going to ultimately look like, but you can see all of those sort of loosey-goosey lines on the side.
So I ended up pinching them out and then taking some alterations in the mock-up and then putting it on again. And then here's after the first round of alterations, so you can see everything fits a lot smoother. I've drawn some new style lines on. I've sort of cut and slashed where I needed to open things up a little bit to get a better idea of what the new waistline is going to be. And you can see that everything fits a lot smoother. I took that little camisole off because I wasn't giving me any information. And I feel pretty good about moving into fabric now.
So I just wanted to talk about a couple things here now that I've got all my bodice pieces cut out and ready to be flatlined. This is the side back piece. And you can see that I've cut a broadcloth, which is going to be my back layer, a piece of baby flannel, and this is the fashion fabric. So the reason I do a baby flannel is because this taffeta is a little on the thinner side, as silks tend to be. And so you're gonna see a lot of lumps and bumps from the corset and other layers behind it. So the baby flannel gives us sort of a smoothing layer, which, because it's got a little loft to it, just gives us just a little bit of smoothing capability to the bodice that will help us hide some of the boning and other sort of lumps from the corset that we're going to get. And then the broadcloth is, because the baby flannel has just a little bit of stretch to it, especially on the cross grain, the broadcloth just gives us another kind of structural base to it, but it's thin enough that's not going to add bulk. If I'm not wearing a corset and I'm building a historically based garment, I will use a layer of coutil instead of broadcloth, and then the boning will be attached to the coutil before we flatline it onto here. I do have a corset, or stays, I guess, for this dress, so I don't need to have that layer. The other thing I wanted to show you is that I don't add seam allowance to my pattern pieces. And the reason that I don't do that is because it makes it much easier to true my pattern up and make alterations as needed later. Also, I like to be able to mark my stitch lines. The reason I do that is because I think it offers more precise stitching, especially if you don't want to add a very precise seam allowance. So this is 5/8. It also allows me to add varying seam allowances. So sometimes on the top or bottom, I didn't for this one, but I would make it maybe 1 inch instead, so I have a little bit of give with my edges if I want to make it longer or shorter. And it also makes it a little bit more precise for stitching purposes, because if my seam allowance of my cut line is like a scant eighth bigger or smaller, it's not going to affect my stitch line. It's just going to make my seam allowance different. So those are the reasons why I don't add seam allowance. You can definitely do whatever you want. Commercial patterns are almost always going to have seam allowance added. Totally fine. It's your own preference. This is how I was taught how to pattern, and so this is how I feel comfortable stitching. The other thing that I wanted to show you was that on my front side bodice piece, you can see that I have a seam here at the strap. This is sort of at the upper, sort of right before your shoulder starts, but I didn't cut that into the flannel or the silk. And this seam is a historical seam, so you're going to find this in almost all historical garments, but I don't like it visually. So they would do this to conserve fabric, which makes perfect sense. I didn't need to do that, and I didn't want to have that seam line. I wanted to have a nice smooth line going up the bodice. But I decided to put that seam into my broadcloth layer, and I've drawn on my grain lines here. So you can see the grain line is coming this way on the main part of the piece, and then it's coming this way along the straight of this strap.
And if I hold a ruler here, you can see how different that grain line is. If we cut this all in one, like I did the flannel and the silk, this would have a tendency to stretch, and then the shoulder strap would be a little bit too big on me at some point. So because I cut the broadcloth layer with the straight of the grain going straight up and down the strap, it's going to keep these layers from wanting to stretch as much as they would if all three were cut in one. I thought about cutting the flannel with the seam, but I thought that that might give me a little lump here where the seam allowance is folded, so I decided not to do that. Again, if this was coutil, that would give us even more strength, but since I don't have the boning built into the actual body of the dress and it's in the stays, I think that this is going to be fine. You could always add like a little stay strap, like a little ribbon from this seam to this seam, just to kind of keep it from stretching out more. So that is kind of what I want to talk about there. And I'm going to go ahead and start flatlining these. So after I flatlined those pieces together, I stitched them together, and then I was ready to try everything on. So here you can see that I have made the stomacher at this point, so I was able to pin that into the bodice when I tried it on, and I've got a really great fit here. It fits very similarly to the mock-up, so everything's pretty smooth. The waistline is not clipped yet, so that is, I kind of fold that underneath, but I've got a pretty good indication on how the bodice is going to fit, and pretty happy with it. So now I'm going to move on to the sleeve. So I've been working on my sleeve here, and I think this is maybe number 4 mock-up. You can kind of see I've kind of drawn it all over it and made a couple other alterations. But I think I'm happy with this iteration. On me, since I'm not quite this dress form, my shoulders are more slopey, so I needed a little bit more room here, kind of in the ball of the shoulder. But with this sleeve, I actually have full range of movement, which is nice, which I wanted to be able to do. You can see I've drawn a couple other alterations I wanted to make here, but this I think is going to work. And I also drew a parallel line with the floor so that I knew where to draw on my embroidery design. And also this is sort of like where the center of the outside of my arm falls. So that's kind of my 2 axis thing. So when I'm drawing out my design, it will end up going up and down as opposed to like this, which is what it would do if I was following the grain of the sleeve. And just so you can see where I started, this is the pattern that I scaled up from Patterns of Fashion from from 1780. So this is kind of what sleeves looked like at that point, which is very different from what we expect now. But you've got that that shoulder seam that sort of pushes out to the back, which is how the bodices are shaped. So you need to have a little bit different shape of sleeve for that. So if we look at where I ended up, this as it was really tight on me, so it wasn't useful as much as I thought. As well as the bodice fit, I was a little surprised that the sleeve was as small as it was. So this is where I ended up. So you can see, looking at where the shape of the sleeve started, how much I needed to slash and spread this. So the cap of my sleeve got much bigger, and it got a little bit bigger here. I ended up shortening it a little bit, and then this curve for your forearm to stick through is higher than it was here. I didn't want to do the detail that you often get where you take the little tuck here. I didn't want to have that line, so I omitted it, which means that then your curve needs to be much higher to accommodate your arm. And I ended up adding in that last pattern muslin that I did. This was my sort of final alteration, was I added a little bit here to accommodate the front of my arm, which slopes forward or rounds forward. And then I also shaved in a little bit here to get a little bit closer of a fit in the actual sleeve. So I'm happy with this, and I'm going to go ahead and draw those axis lines from the drape onto here, and then I can start drawing my embroidery design onto the flat sleeve and get started on that. And then this, I think, is what my embroidery design is going to be over the top of that. So I'm going to pick up some, actually, I think I decided I was going to flip it and do it this way instead. So I'm going to pick up some embroidery thread this week and do some samples of what I think that's going to be. And I also am about to bind off the bottom of the bodice. So I've got some bias that I've made, and I altered where the bottom of this bodice is going to come to. So of course taffeta does scar. So I had my old stitch line in there, and then I took that out and moved it down. So it's a little unfortunate that that fabric scars, but here we are. So I'm going to bind off the bottom by stitching my bias onto the edge and then turning it under, and then whip stitching it to the interior layers. Okay, so that is where I'm going to stop this for today. And next time we will talk about applying the gold work onto the bodice and the skirt and sort of starting to finish up some of that. Thanks for being here. Ask me any questions in the comments about the build, and I will see you guys next time.